Okay, so this is Module 2, and in Module 2, the readings actually cover quite a bit of content. Just two things that I wanted to say a little bit about here in this presentation. There is a second kind of mini lecture for Module 2 called Literature Reviews that includes a separate PowerPoint and some discussion about your literature review assignment. But in this presentation, we're going to talk about two things. The first thing is types of inquiry. Primary thing we're going to talk about there is the difference between qualitative and quantitative research. And then the second half of this presentation, we'll start talking specifically about developing a good research question and how formulating a research question relates to the type of inquiry, the type of data that you might collect. That becomes important because then at the end of this module, you, if you have not already done so, are going to start sharing with your classmates ideas that you have about the research question for your research proposal. So when we talk about methods of inquiry, we're talking about the difference between quantitative and qualitative research. And there is something, by the way, there's a third option called mixed methods research. And so we need to talk a little bit about the difference between quantitative and qualitative and why you would use each. So what's quantitative research? So quantitative is exactly what it sounds like. It's about quantity. So quantitative data is data that is numbers based. So there's an emphasis on precise and generalizable findings. If your study or any study is aimed to determine causality, meaning you are out to explain something, to say X causes Y. If your research question says, does race impact recidivism rate? That's a causality-based explaining sort of question, and you would absolutely have to use quantitative data to do that. Quantitative data, quantitative inquiry also requires predetermined exact methods of measurement, and it often utilizes comparison groups. So it's very numbers-based, and it's about close-ended questions. So what's important to understand here is when we say numbers-based, that doesn't necessarily mean that quantitative data, that quantitative questions are only questions that can be answered with numbers. But quantitative questions are questions that have close-ended categories. So if you say, you know, what is your race? And that question has categories: African American, Caucasian, Latino, Asian Pacific Islander. That's a quantitative question because it's a close-ended question. By contrast, there's qualitative research. Qualitative research is open-ended questions. So when do we use qualitative research? We use it when we want to tap into the deeper meaning and experience of people in our studies. So we're exploring things. That's what qualitative research does. You're not aimed to measure causality. You're not trying to explain something. You're just trying to explore the possibilities that are out there. So it measures, qualitative inquiry is often used to measure things that can't be reduced to numbers. You'll see when we start talking about research questions that qualitative research is used when you want to understand the experience that someone is having, and that experience can't necessarily be put into boxes and categories. It's flexible, it's constantly changing. Typically, qualitative research has a much smaller sample size, and we're going to talk a lot more about sampling in a module a couple weeks from now. But you need less people in a qualitative study because you're not aimed to generalize the results. We do this with open-ended questions, and we do this typically qualitative research is typically done at the beginning of exploring something. So when little is known about a topic, then we might want to do qualitative research to find out more about it. Now, what happens if you say, well, you know, I'm starting to design this study and I think that I want the study to have some qualitative and some quantitative elements. You can absolutely do that. It's called mixed methods inquiry. Mixed methods inquiry is pretty common, actually. And if you think about things on a continuum, and you'll see that throughout this course, we're actually going to build a research continuum here in a second. But if you think about things on a continuum from purely qualitative to purely quantitative, mixed methods is somewhere in the middle. And it's a really lovely way to get the benefits of the objectivity of quantitative data and the depth of understanding of qualitative data. And so it integrates them both together. So here's that continuum I was talking about. I want to take just a minute here to introduce this, because you're going to see this continuum, I think 4, maybe 5 times throughout the course. So you're not going to find this continuum in a textbook anywhere because it is something that I have started to create, although you will read all of these concepts. So I'm a visual learner, and so in the hopes of helping kind of visual learners sort of summarize everything we talk about in this class into one continuum, we're going to continue to build this continuum, put more pieces on it as we go along. And the idea of this continuum is that it will help inform decisions that you make about what a good research study should be designed like. So we're going to build that continuum, and today we're going to start with these first pieces. Again, that continuum that goes from qualitative to quantitative. So on that qualitative end, what you can see on this slide is that qualitative measures are about exploring what's out there, right? And by contrast, quantitative measures are about explaining what's out there, with our friend mixed methods somewhere in the middle. Okay. And so once we understand the difference between qualitative and quantitative research, and once we understand that we have choices to make when we design a research study, that we can either design a research study that is very focused on explaining something, again, X causes Y, or we can design a research study that's really about exploring what's out there. This is called problem formulation, and this is how you turn a topic, how you turn your thing into a research question. That's one of the big tasks of this module, is taking that thing that you described to us in our voice threads and turning it into a very measurable research question. So now we're going to talk a little bit about those research questions. So first, again, understanding that the purpose of your research will determine the type of inquiry that you use and will determine your research question. So again, if we think about exploratory and explanatory, now we're adding a middle point. It'll show up on the continuum here in a second. Exploratory research, initial understanding of an unexplored phenomenon or topic. That's that qualitative piece. So if you're out there to just understand something that, you know, is uncharted territory that no one's kind of explained before, it's called exploratory research. By contrast, explanatory research is about looking at a specific relationship. And so then what's in between is something called descriptive research. And descriptive research is a little more precise than just exploring what's out there, but not necessarily trying to prove causality, X causes Y. Instead, describing characteristics of a population. So how does that link to research questions? Well, exploratory questions, those qualitative kind of questions, are what we call existence questions or composition questions. Versus causality, as you can see down there on the bottom. We are going to, in a future module, talk a lot more about the difference between causality and correlation. Correlation, you see, shows up there in the middle because finding a correlation is about proving whether there's a relationship between two variables. Not necessarily X causes Y, but there's a relationship there, and that's about descriptive questions. I pulled this chart from the textbook, and I like this chart because it gives examples of the different types of questions. So explanatory questions are up there towards the top. These are causality questions. Does X cause Y? You can see those descriptive questions in the middle, relationship questions. Is group A different than group B? Is there a relationship between X and Y? And then those exploratory questions, right? Which is, does X exist, right? What are the components? Really understanding kind of a new phenomenon. So how does this relate, again, to building your research study or to evaluating research studies that are out there? Well, what you'll see here is every time we build the continuum, the new pieces are going to show up on the slide in orange. So those black pieces are the pieces that were there a couple minutes ago. And now we're adding the type of research question. So if things fall on that qualitative end of the continuum, you're going to be looking to design a research question that is one of those existence questions. What are experiences like for this population? Does this phenomenon exist? In the middle, those relationship questions. Is there a relationship between X and Y? And causality questions on the end. If your study is truly aimed to find out whether one variable causes another. So this is a slide you probably want to come back to and think about as you figure out what the best research question is for your study. So let's talk a little bit more about what makes a good research question. So research questions have to be ethical. We will spend all of next week, actually, you'll spend understanding research ethics. They have to be ethical. They have to be narrow and specific. So there's an example here. This is the difference between a research question that says, is childhood sexual abuse an important issue in the treatment of depression among women? That's a good question, but listen to the difference between that question and this. What proportion of women in treatment for depression report being sexually abused as a child? You can see that that second question is much more specific. It's much more clear as to exactly what we're trying to get at. It's a much more quantitative question. That first research question could be a possibility, but if you want to find out if something's important, that's going to be a pretty qualitative, subjective sort of question to answer. So narrow and specific as you can be. And so as you post in the discussion board this week, ideas that you have about turning your thing into your research question, I encourage you to help your fellow classmates really make those questions narrow and specific. If you see someone post a question that looks a little bit like that first one, maybe you could say, have you thought about this? And see if you can help each other to make things more narrow and specific. And you'll see that I will also show up in that discussion board and probably do a lot of those same things for you. Next, a research question has to be written in a way that can be answered by observable evidence. So you can't say, should criminal sentences for perpetrators of sexual abuse be stiffer? That's an opinion question, and opinion questions are not research questions. And you can't say, does God exist, right? We can't prove that. Now, we, on faith, know that, right? But we need to have things that are researchable if we're going to make it a research study and a research question. It also has to be relevant to policy and practice. My slide says social work because I'm a social work professor, but you could replace that with be relevant to criminal justice practice and policy, substance abuse practice and policy, whatever your field is. And lastly, it has to have more than one acceptable answer to the research question. We'll talk a little bit more about this in 2 weeks when we start talking about variables and hypotheses, but your chapter talked about hypotheses. You have to be open to the fact that you might not find what you want to find, and your research question has to be open to more than one possible answer. Okay, so then that leads us to the discussion board activity. So I would encourage you from here to take this information, to really read over things in your textbook, and then let's start having a conversation in that discussion board about formulating a good research question for you. Again, a research question that you make sure the type of question you design fits with the aims of your study, and that ultimately will get you to the first piece of, is this a quantitative or a qualitative study? Look forward to having conversations with you in the discussion board.